Hey everyone, Nick Raboy here from Couchbase. We're going to be looking at how to use GraphQL to query for data from the front end where the data exists in a Couchbase NoSQL database. So this application that we're going to be building today is going to be using Node.js, but don't feel obligated to use Node.js when using GraphQL because you can use it for most languages nowadays. But for this example, we will be using Node.js, Couchbase. We're going to be using Express Framework for Node.js, and we're going to be using GraphQL. And by the end of this, you should see that, there are some benefits to using GraphQL in your application development rather than using a classic RESTful API. But I'll let you establish your own opinions as we go, and we'll elaborate on everything that we did towards the end. So the first thing that we want to do, I do have Couchbase up and running. I do have a bucket added. I have some indexes created for querying. I have some user roles created. I have basically all of Couchbase set up because that's not really the goal of this tutorial. Our goal is going to be creating an application that uses GraphQL. Now, everything that I've already set up, it's not complicated to do. It'll take you 5 minutes maximum to do all of this. So don't get too hung up on that step. So I do have a terminal up. What I want to do is I want to create a new project. I'm going to create a new project on my desktop. I'm going to call it GraphQL project. I'm going to navigate into it. And the first thing inside of this project is I'm going to say npm init-y. And what that's going to do is it's going to create a new package.json file for me. Now, inside of this project, we need to add a few project dependencies. And we can do that by saying npm install. We can say Couchbase, which is going to be our Node.js Couchbase SDK. We're going to use Express Framework, and we're going to use some middleware for GraphQL. It's going to be the Express GraphQL middleware. And then finally GraphQL, and then UUID, which is going to be used for Couchbase when it comes to creating mutations, so adding documents to the database. So let's go ahead and do -- save, and then wait for it to finish. All right, so the dependencies are added. I don't have any project file to add code to, so let's go ahead and say touch app.js, and that created an app.js file. I also want to install one more package. It's more of a convenience, not a necessity. So I'm going to say npm install nodemon --save dev. And what nodemon does is it allows us to kind of hot reload our project every time we hit save, so that way we don't have to continuously stop and start our project every time we make a change. Again, it's just a convenience. It's not a necessity. Totally up to you. All right, so with our project ready to go, let's go ahead and open it. I'm going to be using Atom by GitHub, but it doesn't really matter what IDE you use. Anything will really get the job done. So we do have nodemon available to us. Let's open up our package.json file and we can add it into our script section. We can say start or whatever you want to call it. And then we're going to say nodemon, which exists inside of our node modules directory. And we're going to watch the app.js file. Now if we go to our app.js file, we can start including those dependencies that we've downloaded. So for one, we can say constant express equals require express. Constant couchbase equals require couchbase. We can say constant express GraphQL. And we can say equals require express GraphQL. You can see where I'm going with this. It's just I'm including everything that we just downloaded. We're going to call this one actually build schema. I know a lot of people just call it schema, but I'm going to call it build schema. Be a little different here. Require, and I'm going to say GraphQL dot build schema, and that's going to be used for actually creating our document schema that's going to be queryable from a front end using a GraphQL query. Then finally, we're going to say constant UUID equals require UUID. Now we can work towards setting everything up. So it's going to be a little different from a typical Express application because we're not actually creating API endpoints, but it's not any more complicated than the previous approach. So what we can say is we can say var app equals express like we normally would. But then what we have here is we have something like var schema. And like I said, this is going to be for our document schema. Even though that we're working with a NoSQL database, we still need some kind of schema for GraphQL to be successful. So we're going to say equals, we're going to say build schema, and we're just going to leave it as empty string for now. We're also going to include some resolvers. So we have our schema, which is our definition on what's queryable, but our resolvers are actually going to be functions. So if you run like a GraphQL kind of schema property that's a function, while the resolver is the definition on how that function is actually used. And in short, it's actually going to be our queries against Couchbase. So these are non-GraphQL queries against Couchbase. And you'll see it'll make perfect sense in just a moment. But we'll leave that as an empty object for now too. We're just really bootstrapping our application for the start. Now that we have that, we need our single API endpoint. So yes, we're not using a traditional RESTful API, but we still need an endpoint that we can access. This endpoint is going to be where we send all of our GraphQL queries to. So we can say app.use. The endpoint is going to be GraphQL. And we're going to say express GraphQL. And we're going to say schema is going to be the schema that we have defined that's currently empty. The root value is going to be our resolvers. And then do we want graphical? So graphical is a graphical user interface that allows us to execute queries using GraphQL. It's optional, but for this example, it's going to be very valuable to us because we're still learning about GraphQL. Now, we need to listen. So we need to start our Express Framework server. So we can say app.listen. Let's listen on port 3000. And we're going to say console.log listening, and that's fine. And we can save it. So we have a starting point for this particular application. Now with our starting point set and done, we need to figure out, well, what kind of data are we going to be accessing for this application? We don't have anything in our database as of now. Let's come up with a very easy example. So an easy example, at least in my mind, might be kind of a crude blogging mechanism. So we have accounts for a blog, and then we have actual blog entries for any given account. So it's not the craziest example, but it's an example that will allow us to truly test our GraphQL skills. So let's start defining that schema, and we're using backticks here, so that way we can do multiple line strings. It'll be a little cleaner for us. But we're going to say type account, and we're going to say ID, and that's going to be of type string. First name, that's also string. Last name, also string. So very simple for account. Nothing unexpected here. And then for blog, we're going to follow the same strategy. We're going to have an ID, which is a string. We're going to have an account, which is actually going to refer to the account up here that we just created, but it's going to be an account ID. So we're going to say string. It's a required property, so we're going to have an exclamation mark there. We're going to have a blog title, which is a string, and we're going to have blog content, which is a string. So this is a very, very plain, basic kind of schema that we've just created. So all good so far. The next step is, well, we need to probably connect to Couchbase because we have all of this kind of bootstrap here, but we have nothing in terms of our database. So we can do this up near the top after Express or before. It doesn't really matter. But we're going to say var cluster equals new couchbase.cluster. And we're going to say Couchbase, and we're going to get that IP address for our instance here. So I'm going to copy it. I'm going to paste it in. If you just added HTTP and a bunch of slashes, make sure you remove them. It's fooled me before. I've actually spent a good deal of time trying to troubleshoot what was going wrong when in fact I had some extra characters in there. So don't get fooled like I did. We're going to say cluster.authenticate. We're going to provide it a username and password. And like I said, I already created a username and password. It's not difficult to do. but it's out of the scope for this tutorial. So we're going to say example, and that's my password. Very simple. Then we're going to say var bucket equals cluster.openBucket, and the bucket that we're going to be using is called example as well. So we have our database information. Now we need to go and we need to adjust our schema a bit. So we have these two types, but we don't have any information when it comes to querying or mutating. So let's go ahead and add some query information. So query is the type of queries that you can run using GraphQL. So we have a query. One possible query might be to get account information or accounts. Now, the responsive accounts would be an account type, so an account object, so what we've already created down there. So, and it's going to be an array, hence the square brackets. Now, another option might be to get a single account. So we can say account. We can say that an ID of type string is required in order to run this query function. And as a response, we're going to get an account that is not an array. Another option might be blog or blogs. Let's say blogs plural. Now this, we're always ever going to need an account string. So we're going to define it because blogs are always associated to accounts. And that's going to return blog in square brackets. And then finally we have blog, which is going to be ID. We can get it based on the blog ID. It is a required field, and we're going to say blog. All right, so we have our query. Wasn't too extravagant, but it'll help us get the job done. Now what we can do is we can go to the resolvers, and we can start creating these resolver functions for the queries. So it might make sense to start with the accounts, because that is probably the simplest query since there's no kind of data input that we're going to be using. So we're going to say accounts. And we're inside the resolvers. We're going to create a function, and we're going to say var statement equals, we can say select meta. Let's go ahead and give it an alias of account.id. We can say account. We're going to get all properties from account, and we're going to say from example, and we can say as account where account.type equals account. So very kind of, I mean, to me it's a simple query, but it may not be. But it's a simple select query. We're getting the ID and we're getting all properties of the document. We have to get the ID separately because we're never actually going to store the ID in the document itself. We're gonna get it from the meta information. So we're going to say query equals couchbase.nickelQuery from string, pass that statement in, and now we're going to execute it. So we're going to say, but before we execute it, we have to note that the resolvers expect a promise. The Couchbase Node.js SDK uses callbacks. It'll use promises in a future release, but as of right now, we have to kind of wrap it into a promise. So we're going to say return new promise, resolve, reject. And we're going to say bucket.query error result. So this is the Couchbase stuff. I'll add some semicolons there. If there was an error, we're going to say return reject error. And then GraphQL will handle the rest there. Otherwise, what we're going to say is we're going to say resolve, and we're going to say result. Now we can cheat a bit because we don't have any kind of mutations in there. What I'm going to do is I'm going to create some data that has a type of account. I'm actually going to have it match this account type right here, and then we're going to try to run this. So we're going to experiment. So let's go back into Couchbase. We're going to go into our example bucket, and we're going to go to documents, and we're going to say add document. I'm going to give it some random value. Doesn't really matter the ID. Remember, they're going to be uniquely generated in the future. We're going to say save. I'm going to say first name is Nick. Last name is Raboy. Type is account. And I'm going to click save. Now that we have data in the database, Let's go ahead and run our application. It's not currently running. We can say npm start because we have nodemon. It's listening. So we go back into our web browser. We can say localhost port 3000/GraphQL. And it opens that graphical interface because remember, we've enabled it. Now to actually run this query, what we can do is we can do the following. So we can say accounts, and we can define what data we want back. So let's go ahead and say we only want the last name. So I've added it. I'm going to say run. We got one account back with the last name. Now let's say I want the ID as well. I'm going to run it again. Gave me the ID. Going to run it again. Let's say I want the first name as well. You see how I was able to customize exactly the data that I wanted back. Now it's not particularly obvious for this example because we're selecting all of this data in a single query. But had I been chaining multiple resolvers together through this front-end GraphQL query language, I can actually just determine what I want back. It can do multiple requests against the database, but it's all done in a single request from my query. So I don't have to make requests to 10 different endpoints to get the job done. I define exactly what I want in a single query. GraphQL hits my backend, and it does exactly what I want with my backend technologies. So let's go ahead and go down the chain here. We're gonna continue towards making our application successful. We have accounts. Now it makes sense to do account singular. So we're going to say account. This time around, we are expecting some data input. We're going to say, for this function, we're going to say var id equals data.id. And we're going to say return new promise. We're going to say resolve, reject, and we're going to run our Couchbase statement. So we're going to say bucket.get. We're going to say, we're going to pass in the ID. If there was an error or a result. The actual interaction with Couchbase is the easy part. It's just building all of these functions, and it's not even that hard. It's just a lot of code to kind of bootstrap this thing. But we're going to say if error, and we're going to say return reject error. Otherwise, we're going to say resolve result.value. Now, let's go ahead and give it a try. So I have it, I saved it, it automatically hot reloaded it for me. We have an ID here. So what we're going to do in our graphical is we're going to look at these query variables, and we're going to add our query variable. So let's give it a try. So first off, we're going to say ID. We're going to paste in that ID. Does not appear to be used. That's because we're not using it yet. Let's wipe this out. Let's go ahead and say query. Let's say get account data. We're going to use a parameter called ID. It's going to be string and it's going to be required, hence the query variables. We're going to say account, and we're going to say ID uses that parameter that's being passed. And then on success, let's just use the first name. And let's run it, and hopefully we get back Nick. And we did. So we specified. Now, had I included another record in the database, it would have only gotten Nick. But if I had done just the generic query, the anonymous query, it would have gotten all records back. And we're going to test this later on as we go. Let's go ahead and worry about, well, now maybe we want to do a mutation. We have queried for our data. Now we need to worry about creating data. And we actually have to make a change. So we have to make a change in our build schema. We have to add a mutation statement. So let's go ahead. We can add it to the bottom. I don't think it matters where you add things, but I like to go down the line in terms of consistency here. But let's go ahead and say type mutation. And we're going to say create account. It's going to require a first name. It's going to be a string, and it's required, and a last name. That's also going to be a string required. Now, in theory, you'd probably want to do more than this, maybe even use an object rather than a string, but this is a very simplistic demo, so it doesn't really matter to us. And as a response, we're going to get an account back. So let's go ahead and save it for now. So back in our resolvers, we're going to now add this mutation here. So we're going to say create account, exactly as it was named up above. And this is going to require data, like we saw previously. We're going to say var ID equals uid.v4 for our unique ID value. We're going to say data.type equals account. And we're going to do our whole return promise stuff again. So I can actually, let's go ahead and copy this code from our account, and we're going to change it up a bit. So instead of get, this is going to be insert. And before we actually, well, actually when we insert it, we're going to use, we're actually going to use data. So what was passed in. And let's go ahead and manipulate our response, because if we insert the data and then we just return result, it's going to be a cast value, and the cast value isn't entirely useful to us. So what we can do is we can copy this bucket.get. Let's replace the resolve. We're going to say bucket.get. We're passing in that ID that we had just used to create. If there was an error, rejected. Otherwise, we're going to resolve it. We're also going to say result.value equals, well, not result.value, result.value.id equals ID. And we're just going to say result.value, and that should work. Now, what we want to do is we want to try this. We want to test it out, make sure that everything's great. So let's go ahead and give it a try. We're going to go back into our dashboard here. We're going to remove this for now. I'm actually going to cut it so that way we can come back to it. But let's go ahead and say mutation, create account. There's going to be a first name parameter. That's going to be a string. A last name parameter. That's also going to be a string. We're going to call the create account. Going to be a first name. It's going to use the first name that we had just defined. Last name that we had just defined. And as far as our result goes, we're going to return the ID. We're going to return the first name. And we're going to return the last name. We need to change our query variables. We're going to change first name to Maria. Last name is going to be Raboy. And hopefully, when I run this, it should return with our results. So let's go ahead and try it. We're going to say run it. And it did. So it returned the ID, it returned the first name, the last name. If I go to the Couchbase dashboard here and I look at my editor, the data is there. So exactly as we expected, it returned it. If we wanted to, what we can do is we can go back to our initial function here. We can say accounts. And you know, we might actually just be able to say accounts, and it might just work if I want all properties here. So no, it only returned the ID there. That's fine. First name, last name, run it, and you can see that I have 2 records now. So far so good. This is exactly what we anticipated. We're gonna go down the line here. We've got just a few more left. It's in regards to the actual blogging. So that makes sense that maybe we want to create a blog function. So let's go ahead and go back into our build schema. Instead of just create account, we're also going to have create blog. And we're going to say, this time around, it's going to say account, because this is going to be the account ID. It's going to be a string. It's required. It's going to have a title. It's going to have content, all of which are strings. And as a response, we're going to return blog. Now, same kind of strategy that we saw previously. Let's go ahead and copy this create account. We can recycle a lot of it. Instead of create account, we're going to say create blog. We're going to generate a new unique ID, like we saw. Instead of account, it's going to be blog. We're going to return a new promise. We're going to insert it. And we're going to essentially just do the same thing we just did for creating the account. So we're going to save it. We can go back into our editor here, the graphical. Let's go ahead and roll back some of this stuff. To save us some typing, we're going to say create blog. We're going to say that it requires a account, title, and content. Let's go ahead and copy this ID. We'll copy mine for safekeeping because we will be using it. We're going to say account. It's a process for GraphQL, but again, you don't have to use GraphQL, and you probably won't be using it in production. This is just good for testing. And then finally, content. And this is create blog. Let's go ahead and say title, content, and we're going to pass some stuff in here for our query variables. So first of all, account is going to be what I've just copied. Title, it's going to be test blog, and then content is going to be this is a test blog article. I'm going to run it, and hopefully it works. Failed to fetch. So let's see if maybe we have some logs. Unexpected identifier create blog. So maybe I forgot a comma somewhere. Let's take a look. I did forget a comma. So let's go ahead and save it. Let's go ahead and try to run it again. This time it worked. So it did what it was expected to do. So I go back into my Couchbase dashboard, and I see that I have a blog entry there for the account. So far, so good. We do want to finish this up. We want to create our other functions, which would be our blogs plural, as well as just get a singular blog. So let's go ahead down here. I'm actually going to copy what we have. So for account and accounts, save us some time. Add a comma there this time so I don't have an error. For blogs, plural, it will expect data. Likewise with blog, it will also expect data. For the query statement, for blogs plural, it's going to be a parameterized query. So we're going to change a few things. First of all, blog. So the alias is blog. Of course, the type has to be equal to blog, not account. And for the parameterization, we need the account name. So we're going to say and blog.account equals some kind of parameter. So the parameter name doesn't really matter, but it will be something that we use in the next step. So inside of the bucket.query, we're going to say query, but this is where we pass in our parameter. It's going to be account, which matches the name of the parameter that we used. And then we're going to say data.account. And it looks like that should be good. So I'm going to save it. What we can do is try this. So let's go back to our editor here. Let's go ahead and copy that ID for the account because we will be using it. Let's go ahead and say blogs. And you know what? We actually have to say, we have to do our query, and we're going to say get blogs. It's going to be an account. We're going to say blogs. It's going to be account. And we're going to say, let's just say title and content. And we actually have the account ID there in our query parameters already, but let's go ahead and try to run it and see what we get. So it returned the array of blogs for that particular account ID exactly as we expected. We're going to finish it up, and then we're going to do one kind of interesting query just to kind of bring closure to this because I know this tutorial is quite lengthy. But for blog, let's go ahead, and we're also going to do something here. We're going to say var data.id sounds good. For ID also sounds good. So everything sounds good so far. So we're just going to do a standard get. So let's go ahead and try it. We can actually get our ID here. We're going to say copy that. we're going to say get blog singular. It doesn't really matter. We're going to say ID. That's going to be ID. And we're going to paste that blog ID in, and hopefully it still returns. Oh, because we used the wrong function here. It's blog singular. Run it. We don't have an ID. It looks like I forgot to return it. Yeah, so I forgot to say result.value equals ID. Result.value.id. So I can go back, run it again. The ID is there. So let's run one more query just to kind of bring closure to this. We're going to say get account data, and it doesn't really matter what we call it, but we're going to say, for one, we're going to say let's go ahead and get account ID. And what we want from this is we want the first name and we want the last name. But we also want to get blog information. So we want blogs, and this is actually going to be account, but it's going to use the same ID, so the same account ID that we're looking up for the person. We don't need the ID for this one, but let's go ahead and get the ID because I forgot the ID off the top of my head. So we're going to get this ID. I'm going to paste it in. I'm going to run it. And as you can see that it got my account information as well as blogs, but you'll have to remember these are two different queries here. This is not the same query, but we've only made one request to the server. So this is kind of where GraphQL shines. We're able to do that. We're able to request any data we want in a single request. The server code does in fact make multiple requests against our database, but that's fine because that's a lot more efficient on our latency than making several requests from our front end through X number of API endpoints. So just as a recap, we did use GraphQL with Express. We hooked it up to Couchbase. We saw two different types of data for account and blogs. We created some mutations, some queries. You do have to make considerations. You still do have to write good queries for your backend. GraphQL is not going to do everything for you, but it will be very useful when it comes to building efficient applications.